This episode was recorded on Saturday, the 2nd of January 2021. So I suppose the very first point of our very first episode is how does one start a podcast?
We should have thought this through
I have
beforehand,
absolutely no idea. Hang on, what does the script say, guys?
He gets another shot.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so it says, welcome to our inaugural episode of What's Next. Welcome to our inaugural episode of What's Next with your hosts, Patrick,
Louis.
And George.
During these episodes, we'll be talking about a variety of topics, from politics to technology, which hopefully you'll find interesting.
To kick off our podcast, because no one else is doing a podcast at the moment, we will be doing a year in review. Myself, Patrick, and Louis have sat down and thought about some things that have happened during each month of 2020 across a variety of topics, and we have also tried to find some good news stories for each month.
Now, 2020 was certainly a year to remember, with protests in Hong Kong, the UK and EU finally striking a trade deal, elections on every continent, space launches, swarms of locusts and killer bees. So we won't be covering everything.
But hopefully you will enjoy this episode. And if you do, feel free to leave a comment on what you might like us to talk about, as we'll probably do another one.
Fingers crossed.
I'm trying to figure out like a good analogy, like a good like comparison to 2020, but I kind of feel like comparing 2020 to a dumpster fire is offensive to dumpster fires. So to kick us off, we have our first story for January 2020. So while coronavirus dominated the year, why was the 31st of January a significant date for us?
I know this one.
Go
Isn't
on.
it the Australian wildfires?
That did happen during January, but that wasn't particularly significant. I mean, it was significant, but just not significant for us.
World Health Organization declaring a pandemic?
That is important for us, but that happened on the 30th, so close but no cigar.
I got it.
Go on.
Brexit.
It is correct. So about half our listeners just switched off. But look, Brexit kicked off in the new year in 2020 and ended 2020. And 2021 also started with a little bit of Brexit spice as the transition period ends and new relationship began. So Brexit kind of acted as a sort of bookend for the year, with the UK officially leaving the EU on the 31st of January 2020, and then an 11-month transition period following. So what a ride. I mean, let's not quite discuss what's next for Brexit, because, you know, we're now moving into this 6-month implementation period, but cast your mind back to January 31st. Did you think we would have a deal? Did you think Boris would have survived 11 months? What do you think would have been the case for Brexit?
I would have liked to have thought that it would have happened a bit more promptly, but that being said, I don't think Boris or his government would really have done things much quicker, because it was in their interest to run the clock down.
So, yeah, the suspicion being that when it came to this Wednesday just gone, when they had their vote on whether or not to pass this new EU-UK fabulous deal, it was kind of last minute, and if Parliament voted it down
to the wire?
It was down to the wire, very much so. Like, if Parliament chose not to enact it, then at least Boris Johnson could turn around and be like, well, we did our best. We tried for the British people. And then the onus and responsibility would have been on Parliament. So, yeah, what did you think, George?
Politically, we haven't had a strong Conservative government like this for quite some time. But I feel that our current leader is weak, to be perfectly honest. He's not showing this like powerful, got an idea, I'm going to bring this country through. I know he, in quotation mark, got Brexit done, but one way or another, Brexit was going to happen. Either we would have a deal or we wouldn't. And
I don't think weak is quite the right term. I mean,
sorry, totally subjective. My point.
He's very much, I think, a typical mayoral figure that we would expect, because he set the tone and template for what a mayor looks like, right? But he didn't delegate very well. He kind of took the reins for himself and just sort of marched ahead. And by saying that, we've got to get our way or no way, did it really force the EU to accept what we wanted as a country, or did we kind of bend like bamboo for the EU? I mean, when you read if you ever do read the 1,000 and so word thing, the new arrangement is kind of like trialing EU Lite. We have to pay for all the premium features without being able to talk directly to the developers to say what, as a user, we want the game to do. We still have Horizon Europe. We still have access, but not control of or justification to manage Europol and Eurojust. It's paid for, but we're kind of like up in the crow's nest on top of the mast, where we aren't in the captain's cabin or stood around the navigation table. We just go what we're told, and it could have been worse, but it could have been a lot better too.
Yeah, I can't help but feel that, was it worth burning the bridges to try and eke out every minor advantage? You know, for every bit of delay that's been imposed to try and get a better deal for Britain, is that not just making things more fractious and more tense later on if we ever want to try and be friendly?
Yeah, so I think now we talk about what's next in the world of Brexit, right? So we've moved into the 6-month implementation period.
The issues that are concerning me is what's going to happen realistically with the borders to Northern Ireland. You know, what are the implications really?
But it's also part of the UK, right? And therefore we have to try and like minimize what the border is. So as of the 1st of January, so as of yesterday, right? Yeah. Very little had changed. But the point is we've gone into the 6-month implementation period, right? And until that comes to an end, only then will we see all the bugs come out and all the rotten wood and the sort of chaos that could ensue,
like losing access to GPS.
Yeah, that's also a thing. Yeah, but
so what you're saying is we could potentially be on a sinking ship right now. We just don't know it.
There is that, but let's not cause absolute undue stress and angst for everyone that's listening. It could well be absolute. I mean, let's assume that we've got some sort of competence in government, and you know that it's not really ministers and things like that who actually do the work. It's civil servants, and they're the ones who write the policy, they're the ones who do the research, they're the ones who go and do it. It's kind of then fumbled by a party who are in government at the time, and they're like, well, we'll adopt this, we'll accept this, and we'll change that, and we'll do this to it. But in terms of actually like Northern Ireland at the moment, there were no major issues when it ticked over at 11 p.m. on the 31st. I'm going to say, what's next? Let's be positive. And at the end of the 6 months, everything will be fine, and that all the mechanism will be in place. That's my going into 2021 positive.
I can't help but feel, though, that fine, TM, is not necessarily the best state of being for international relations. You want them to be good. Fine implies...
It brings to mind an ostrich putting their head in the sand.
So we'll put a pin in that, and if anybody wants us to talk more about Brexit, I highly doubt they do. If anyone wants to talk more about Brexit, then we can do something on it again later. But for the time being, let's switch over to our good news story, shall we?
Yeah,
the good news story for January. So there are a number of estimations, but there have been well over 500 million Australian dollars in donations for the Australian bushfires that happened in January 2020.
Hey.
And that number was still rising all the way through the year. So that's a good news story. We managed to raise a lot of money. Not us, but humanity raised a lot of money for the Australian wildfire effort and therefore helped to allay some of the damage. So that's the good news. So now we're going to move on to February.
Well, so this month, London's Metropolitan Police, which for those not in the UK is the large police force that covers the Greater London area and is one of the largest police forces in the UK. They announced that they're going to be deploying and rolling out live facial recognition, so that's LFR for short, to, quote, help tackle serious violence, gun and knife crime, child sexual exploitation, and to help protect the vulnerable. And this comes after trials at 10 different locations, which the Met said were intended to test it in a range of different environments.
Oh, God.
Big
insert concerned noises here. So like any organisation, the police, they want to use new technology to help them do a job. And it's in their interest to try and use all the things at their disposal. And in this case, their job is to reduce serious criminal activity. But the ethical concerns of live police surveillance are non-trivial at best, which is backed up by a paper which was submitted to the British Journal of Criminology back in May, which asserted that LFR is, to quote, an area of significant disagreement.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. I see no problems with this, yes.
Go on, Louis.
So there's an organisation, Big Brother Watcher, and they're a non-profit, non-party civil liberties and privacy campaigning organisation. They've taken issue with the length of time that the collected data is retained. That being said, the Met say that they only compare data against a specific list of individuals.
And who's on that list, Louis?
So According to the Met's documentation on their website, the watch list, in quotes, is based on known individuals who are wanted, subject to court orders such as bail conditions, reported as missing, or deemed as, to quote, presenting a risk of harm to themselves or others. And that last category is by far the one that concerns me the most, as it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Okay. So the Met says that any data which is collected from the cameras is immediately deleted if it does not match anyone from that list. And if it does match, it's kept for a maximum of 31 days unless there was some sort of police action as a result of that, like an arrest or something, at which point it follows normal retention guidelines for evidence.
My only concern with this sort of stuff, as always, is around profiling. So what's to stop any of this being used to target a certain demographic in society?
Technically, nothing.
Yeah.
However, the paperwork that the Met have released, and again, this is all very much you have to trust them on what they say. They say in that the chosen people are based upon the risk factors in that area. So if you know that there is a person who is on bail conditions not to enter a particular area and you are doing live facial recognition in that area, that might be a person to include. If you are looking for people who might be carrying offensive weapons, etc., and you have information to suggest that X person might be, that could be, reason enough to potentially include somebody. But the scope on that is up for a lot of interpretation, which I think is, as you were saying, where the concern comes in. And before we go on to March, we've got our good news story for February, which is free mobility. So in February, Luxembourg, they made public transportation free across the board. Now, this isn't a massive story with a global reach per se, but it is still pretty significant in my opinion. The total cost of running Luxembourg's buses, trams and trains is more than 500 million euros per year, and they only made about 41 million euros in ticket fares. But Luxembourg has more cars per 1,000 people than anywhere else in the EU. So by making public transport free, it aims to reduce the number of cars on the road and to get a better handle on the country's environmental problems that are causing pollution by mobility. A few people have said it's not just about getting people out of their cars, you've got to get them into buses, you've got to encourage that transfer. So it's really good to see countries taking a really firm stance on public transport. So going on to March. George, what have you got for us?
Well, March rolled around, and who put the country on house arrest and why?
I'm guessing this is something to do with COVID.
Well, there's usually to be one massive blur of chaos after chaos, but didn't the EU put everyone on house arrest?
Almost. The EU did close its external borders and internal borders for 30 days on the 17th of March in an attempt to curb the spread of COVID-19. But what I was going to talk about was specifically the UK. We went into a national lockdown on March the 23rd, and February the 28th, we saw the first domestic case of the coronavirus in the UK. That's someone who has not been abroad. And the first death, sadly, in the UK came 1 week later on March the 5th. In late March, India's 1.3 billion strong population was also put into lockdown. Going back to the EU, on the 18th of February, the European Broadcasting Union announced that the Eurovision Song Contest of 2020 was cancelled due to COVID-19 in Europe. However, it is quite interesting in that it's the first cancellation they've had for the contest in 64-year history.
That's a pretty good innings, isn't it? 63 for 64 is not too bad.
I mean, that's older than my dad, and he's no spring chicken. Yeah, the UK went into its first national lockdown on March the 23rd. What do you think is going to happen next, boys?
So this is the first time that we're talking about COVID-19 on a podcast, right? So I'm sure it's probably going to pip its head up somewhere later, like in December. But, well, COVID kind of screwed the pooch a little bit, didn't it? Like, everything just ended in 2020 because of it. But COVID was the biggest thing that happened to the world. Although it was bad, in terms of the environment, it's been the best in the last sort of 50 to 60 years, just due to not everybody being out and about and using cars. But, yeah, what's next for COVID? I'll be surprised if here in the UK we don't go into another lockdown, just because everybody was allowed to travel around on Christmas Day. And we should start seeing in the next week and a half-ish the sort of implications of that.
Well, we already are seeing there's been a massive uptick in cases in the last week, following on from Christmas, presumably, with people either travelling far and wide and bringing it back to their areas, or just the general consequence of more intermingling. And I think, to a certain extent, we are in a second national, well, maybe second or third national lockdown at this point. given that we are now at
Tier 4.
pretty much Tier 4 nationally.
Yeah.
Which, for those who aren't aware, maybe outside the UK, we're on a tiered system, Tier 1 being the most lenient but still alert phase, and Tier 4 being the you cannot leave a house except for very limited reasons. So with most of the nation being on Tier 4, we are effectively in a national lockdown,
Yeah.
but not in name, which I think has its own effect with people not necessarily taking it quite as seriously as they did with the first one.
I think on behalf of everybody on this podcast, at least, a massive thank you to all the frontline workers, especially those in the NHS who've had to put up with underfunding and a society where many people have not chosen to wear masks, therefore further spreading this absolute chaotic virus. But our frontline workers are, without a doubt, real life heroes. So we'll just say thank you at this point to them. A lot of us have been given a really bad end of the stick here, but university students being forced to pay the normal tuition fee rate when they're effectively all being taught online.
Distance learning.
Yeah, it's distance learning, and I know universities set their own tuition fee rates. However, that does not stop the government at any point from stepping in and either forcing universities to reevaluate their tuition fee cap, getting rid of a large chunk of the tuition fee loan, so just saying, okay, this year we're going to wipe off £6,000 of your tuition fee, or investing more heavily in digital learning. I know a lot of universities were not prepared to go online.
I think a lot of students are starting to see what it is like for those with specific learning needs, and that the universities are picking up the system that they are not prepared for with the same sort of attitude that they used to approach those with specific learning needs. If you had someone who's visually impaired or audio impaired, universities would say, yes, we support these students, but quite a lot of universities won't actually have that prepared and waiting until someone comes along for it. And suddenly many thousands of students are seeing that experience themselves, I feel.
It gives a certain track to what it's like living on the other side, so to speak. For our listeners, I am registered visually impaired. For me personally, I found that this year at university, everything being online has been fantastic because I generally meet a lot of issues when it comes to information being put onto me. But I have to admit, it's quite nice. I know for what's going on with COVID, it's terrible. But from the perspective of someone with a visual impairment, actually everything being online, electronic, it's fantastic. Yes, there are still some glitches, but this is probably the first time a lot of the university lecturers, and no disrespect to them, they haven't taught in this medium before, teaching online. It's not normal, and it's going to take a lot of settling down time. What I do hope that comes from this, from the accessibility point of view, is that actually it remains for those who don't want to go into the brick experience, because for whatever reason, if actually having all of these things ready online, whether you have a disability or not, I think that would be amazing if that could be done effectively.
Agreed, and it's a really valid point. But, right, I think it's time to go on to the good news story. George, what have we got?
So this good news story, to quote it verbatim, while social distancing has definitely resulted in some social and economic challenges, it seems to be improving our air quality since travel has decreased across the board. Researchers in New York in March reported early results that carbon monoxide levels produced by cars was decreased by 50% in comparison to the same time in 2019. China and Italy also reported significant decreases in air pollution since the outbreak. Makes sense. Less people using cars, boats, planes, yada, 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 results in less pollutants.
Good news.
Good news. Can we keep it up in 2021? Probably not, but this is a good news story, so let's not dwell on it too much. Anyway.
Thank you, George. So on to April. April was a pretty busy month. So in a matter of days, we had a new leader for the Labour Party. Boris Johnson was admitted to intensive care in London because of COVID. China ended its lockdown in Wuhan. And then right at the end of the month, on April the 27th, the Pentagon formally released 3 videos of unidentified aerial phenomena encountered by US Navy pilots. So, guys, do any of those tickle your fancy?
Can I spin the wheel on a topic here?
Go on then.
Go for it.
I've spun the wheel and it's landed on UFOs.
What a surprise.
Okay, so UFOs. So the quick update on that news. So on April 27th, the Pentagon formally released 3 videos of unidentified aerial phenomena encountered by the US Navy. However, it kind of went rather rapidly under the radar, let's say. So they kind of were like, yep, we admit there are UFO-y sort of things. and it's in the public domain, you now go nuts and have a look at that. But there was absolutely no big hoo-ha. Like, it just kind of... And I wouldn't expect there would be. In terms of, like, the mainstream media, I wouldn't expect them all to go, UFOs! But at the same time, it did kind of go, like, the US Navy were just like, they exist, kind of, in some form. We're not saying they're aliens, but there's UFOs. Go for it.
Yourself and I sat down one evening a while back and we watched the footage.
Caveat that we are not absolute conspiracy nut theories at all. This is not we're not going down that avenue.
This is where I put on my tinfoil hat.
Yeah, they are.
No. But I don't know. So UFOs, can I just clarify? UFOs are completely real. There are flying objects which are unidentified. Whether they are alien beings or extraterrestrial vehicles, different matter. With these vehicles, looking at the footage, I have to say it's not the most compelling footage in the world for me. I mean, it is very blurry, very difficult to make anything out, hence them being unidentified. And there are a plethora of explanations that one can draw on, from international involvement to civilian-owned craft to this and the other. Of course, each one of these is rebutted by various things, such as, but they were travelling at ridiculous speeds, and what's the power source, and the other. But I don't know. It's all a little bit weird. It's hard to know what to think of it.
So, unless George has any comments, we'll spin the wheel one last time for April and talk about one last news story real quick.
I mean, the only thing I think I should just let our listeners know is that both Patrick and Louis are currently wearing very remarkable tinfoil hats on top of their head.
God.
And they'll be joining the Flying Spaghetti Monster sometime soon. But let's roll that wheel.
Okay, so throwing it one last time, I'm going to throw in... Let's talk about Keir Starmer.
We spun the wheel and it lands on Keir.
Good old Starmer.
Literally in the first couple of days of April, Keir Starmer won the 2020 Labour Party leadership election in the UK and became leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition. Now, he took over from Jeremy Corbyn. So Keir Starmer, he is a very good orator. He's a very good public speaker. He knows what he's doing when he stands up at the box. He's kind of more centre-left than, obviously, Jeremy Corbyn was. Jeremy Corbyn, for all intents and purposes, was probably one of the most left-wing leaning party leaders that we've had for quite a while. That's not to say what he said was bad or what he was doing was bad. It's just it had a certain flavour to it. So Keir Starmer, in comparison, is kind of Tony Blair-esque, but I'm sure anybody in the Labour Party would shoot me for saying that.
Is he a little bit too late, or can he recover in regards to having a extremely left-leaning political leader?
And my question is, do you think that Labour can win an election with him as party leader?
Okay, so to answer question one about whether or not he could be more left-leaning, the answer is yes. I mean, it's not difficult to give the soapbox to left-wing policies, eradicating university fees, nationalising the railway or any public asset, for example, so energy, internet, for example, that was one big thing that they ran on in the last election. Not a bad idea, in my opinion. So it's quite easy to go further to the left of the spectrum. It's just like, ideologically, I don't think the UK is there. And Louis, you also asked a question I don't think I answered properly.
Oh, yeah, whether or not, in your opinion anyway, the Labour Party is going to be able to win a general election with him as leader.
They've got 5 years.
Yeah.
Like, on a good day, they have 5 years to build up their base and to espouse their policies. The difficulty is that if they start talking about policies now, it can be very different to what happens in 5 years' time. Between now and then, we could see a dramatic shift in the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson could disappear. There's really no essential need for the European Research Group in the Conservative Party anymore. So, as I say, April was crazy, so we'll skip on now to the good news story, which is a very brief one, but still very good. So, Sweden closed its last coal power plant 2 years early. It's pretty good. Right? So Belgium was the first EU country to end coal power in 2016, and Sweden and Austria have followed suit just a week apart from each other. So Austria first, then Sweden, both in April, meaning that there are now 3 European Union countries that have officially quit coal for residential heating and power generation. And there are many, many, many more, but something's going to happen over the next 10 years to remove coal from their means of production for power and heating. On that note, we're going to go into May with Louis.
Yes, so this is a space story. So on May the 30th, SpaceX launched the first private flight to the International Space Station.
Although that was originally scheduled for the 27th, but, weather is a thing when it comes to launching rockets.
Very true. This mission made NASA astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken the first astronauts to fly from US soil in nearly a decade. So 9 years ago, when the Space Shuttle Atlantis flew for its final time in July 2011, they left behind a US flag, which flew on the very first Space Shuttle flight, and Obama laid down a challenge for a private company to bring it back to Earth, which SpaceX then duly did.
So SpaceX, in effect, won the most epic high-stakes game, most expensive epic high-stakes game of Capture the Flag.
Quite. And fittingly, Doug Hurley, who flew on this mission, he flew upon the Shuttle Atlantis as the mission pilot on that final mission before US astronauts stopped flying, which I think is a nice bookending to this gap in American spaceflight, that he was on the last and then the first. So what do we think is going to be next for American spaceflight and SpaceX?
So a private company put people into space. This wasn't done by the government. This was wholly done by a private company.
So at the end of the noughties, the government in America basically looked to deregulate and commercialize spaceflight in the US. So after retiring the space shuttle, NASA set out to contract to a bunch of businesses like SpaceX and Airbus to develop capsules and rockets that will reduce the cost of spaceflight for NASA. So SpaceX won one of these contracts and have been iterating and innovating to create a bunch of reusable rockets.
Okay.
So they're a private company, and this is a public-funded contract that they've been awarded to replenish the supply to the International Space Station. And then another contract was to take NASA astronauts to the space station. And yeah, they're the first private company to do that since the retirement of the space shuttle from a US private company on US soil. Before that, most governments like ESA and NASA were relying quite heavily on Russia and the Soyuz space capsule, and space rockets, which are their launch system. So, yeah, in effect, private asset, private company, public contract, public astronauts, if you can call them public astronauts that work for a public company, being launched to an international endeavour, being the International Space Station. Anywho, we have a good news story for this month as well, don't we?
We do have a good news story, and it is another environmentally led one. So many humpback whale populations, very specific I know, but previously they've been devastated by commercial whaling, and they are making a comeback.
Woo!
The ban of commercial whaling back in the 1980s led to a strong recovery, with some estimates putting the humpback whale population at around 93% of its pre-86 size. By taking away the threat of hunting and having safe spaces to survive and thrive, humpback numbers have come back dramatically.
Hey!
Humpback whales are great for the environment. On average, a single whale stores about 33 tons of CO2, which would otherwise be in the atmosphere, and it locks that up in carbon within its biomass. If we consider only Arctic humpback whales, this population alone has resulted in 813,780 tons of CO2 being stored in marine life. That's around twice the yearly CO2 emissions of a small country like Bermuda or Belize.
So the way to combat CO2 is to have billions and billions of whales.
Carbon capture? Make more whales. Let's roll on to June.
Let's talk about Hong Kong. So on the 3rd of June, Boris Johnson said the UK will change its immigration laws to offer a pathway to UK citizenship for Hong Kong citizens who are eligible for British national overseas status. After the central government in China passed, it's a fairly long title, so bear with me. The Law of the People's Republic of China on Safeguarding National Security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region.
Wow, I'm so...
It's a fairly comprehensive name, right? For a bit of listening.
Isn't there a fun short name for this?
The National Security Law, we'll just call it the National Security Law, sought to prevent external interference in Hong Kong's affairs, criminalising acts that threaten national security such as subversion and secession, allowing the Central People's Government of China to establish a national security agency in Hong Kong when necessary, bearing in mind they already have a military barracks in Hong Kong, and it requires the chief executive to send the central government periodic reports on national security. Basically, it's looking to undo the two countries, one system framework.
And that was meant to last until 2047.
It was. It's meant to. So it's got another 26 years on top of it to go. But China is trying to prevent Hong Kong from being Hong Kong.
Okay.
And the UK have said, by implementing this policy, we're going to try and allow Hong Kong citizens who are eligible for British national overseas status, so they're an ex-colony of the UK, can then come to the UK and get citizenship. They're trying to integrate Hong Kong quicker as part of their territory. But there's also a lot happening in the South China Sea. They're building islands to improve or to increase their coastal range to claim parts of the South China Sea as their own.
It's an interesting naval acquisition strategy of, so we get access and rights over the water that is within X miles of our coast. Well, we'll build more coast.
It's a very big political football that I don't think we can talk about in 5 minutes, to be honest with you. It's something that happened last year in June. It's worth noting that Hong Kong, as a devolved authority, is being assumed into the larger China. And the UK is offering to do something, but at the same time, it's small.
I think it's good they're doing something, though.
It's something which is easy to implement, give Hong Kong citizens UK citizenship, hope for the best, I think. Yeah.
Anyway, we've got a good news story, I think, haven't we?
So the good news story for June. So a pretty short good news story. According to the Department for Transport, there was a reported 200% surge in cycling in the UK since March. This is most likely driven by a fear of catching coronavirus on public transport, but still, more cyclists, less cars for now. So that's pretty good. It's a result of the pandemic, but people just don't want to use public transport, so they've just opted to start being a bit healthier and cycle. So moving swiftly on to July then. Russian to the vote. If we can't guess what that pun's about, then I don't know what to do. The Russian constitution, at least before the 1st of July, would have required Mr. Vladimir Putin to step down from the Russian presidency in 2024 at the end of his second consecutive 6-year term. However, in mid-January, Putin sneaked in some proposals for amendments to the constitution, and on March the 10th, a Russian Duma deputy proposed said amendments that would reset Putin's presidential term limit clock to 0. A move that would have allowed him to run for office in 2024 and 2030. Now, Russia's parliament and regional governments ratified this amendment, or these amendments, in mid-March, and the Constitutional Court approved the changes. So Russia already has a 2-term limit on presidencies, but now the parliament can reset this limit, effectively creating permanency. On June the 25th, public voting opened for these amendments that had already been passed. So voters had about a week to cast their ballots in person for already approved amendments. So Putin didn't actually need to give the Russian people a vote, but he just decided to give it some popular support, as it were. So, in fact, not only had the constitutional amendments already been enacted, the new amendments to the Constitution had already been printed and sent to bookstores for sale before the vote had even happened.
Wow.
That's a little bit strange in my opinion. So, the actual amendment that we're talking about to set the permanency of presidency was to remove a simple term of in a row. The amendment now, because it was new, discontinued previous and current terms before the amendment entered in force. So effectively, Putin hasn't already served 2 6-year terms, and he can now start those 6-year terms again.
So if what they're doing is removing the consecutive part of that, does that mean that he needs to take some sort of break?
Well, so he did do that in the past. So he went from being president down to prime minister, then back up to president. It opens up for a lot of things that could potentially go around. So to just very briefly, some other amendments that were already passed as well was that the Russian constitution now supersedes international law. Heads of law enforcement agencies must be appointed by the president.
Okay.
And then in really small print, in consultation with the Federation Council, key being in consultation, not in agreement.
Right.
It ensured that patriotic education was now taught in schools, and the new amendments in the Constitution defined marriage as a relationship between one man and one woman.
Right.
So there's a lot to digest there. The key part of this, depending on who you are, the key part of this for me is that Vladimir Putin now somehow, in some future scenario, could have a never-ending presidency. However, by 2036, he will be, I think, 87. So it's up to him if he wants to continue to be touting around on a horse with no shirt on, but that's up to him. So the question is, what's next for Russia?
Russia calls itself a democracy, for want of a better terminology, but if your leader essentially has free reign to be leader until they either die or by choice of them removing themselves, I mean, where does that really lead itself to democracy?
So the economists do a fairly decent barometer of where countries sit in terms of democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid, and authoritarian regime. And since 2010, Russia has been slipping into the bracket of an authoritarian regime. So you're quite right. It masks itself as being a democracy. However, I think we can all see it for what it is. But then we start looking at, sort of normative theory and things like that. Like, is it our place as a Western country to say that what they're doing is wrong?
Well, I'm not Russian. I don't think necessarily it really is our place to say. However, as much as I can turn around and say Russian politics has nothing to do with me, it does play a large influence on the scope of many different things that occur, including the rights of LGBTQ+.
Well, I guess then we have to ask the question, well, what can we do about it? As Patrick was saying earlier, what place do we have to tell another country how they should or shouldn't conduct themselves? I guess the only thing we can really do then is start to decide to not trade with them or to economically not engage with them. But I'm not sure how well that could really work.
If the UK was part of the EU, we would have been able to economically sanction Russia. But as of January the 1st, that's no longer a case. I think we are completely limited and also probably going to need to trade with Russia. I think our hands are very much tied in this.
Yeah. Well, to lighten the mood a little bit, we've got a good news story, I believe, haven't we, Patrick?
Another animal-related good news story. So, 3 decades after 13 red kites were brought to the UK from Spain, there are now nearly 2,000 breeding pairs across the country. And this success gives the English government high hopes for a 25-year environmental plan, which includes the reintroduction of several other species that have environmental benefits. Historically, these have been either removed, eradicated, etc. So it's good that they've been able to come back and have this environmental impact that we would have seen 30, 40 years ago. So that's a good news story. Anywho, so moving from July into August, I think it would be ignorant of us not to talk about Black Lives Matter. However, we're acutely aware of our privilege as 3 white males and lack thereof of a lived experience. So we're going to try and talk in facts rather than opinions. The peak of the physical movement in 2020 was reached in August before the various elections and before mass COVID restrictions.
From May to August, there were more than 10,600 different Black Lives Matter protests in the United States alone. But protests and demonstrations have not been limited to the US. From Australia to Israel to France, all over the world, people have taken to the streets to express the need for police reform and for systemic change to end racial inequality on a global scale.
The killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others this year has highlighted how pervasive institutional racism is. But this issue does not stop at policing. It exists in other equally existential aspects of life, like healthcare, education, and housing.
We hope that what comes next is a radical reform of social, legal, and political mechanisms to ensure a more equal playing field for all.
For a better understanding of Black Lives Matter and what they stand for, we implore our listeners to go to the Black Lives Matter website and find out how you can support this cause for equality. On the 18th of September 2020, we saw Ruth Bader Ginsburg unfortunately die. She was the bastion of liberal politics, liberal law, liberal practically everything. Republicans moved swiftly to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, forgetting about the precedent they set under Obama, that a president not allowed to make any nomination in an election year.
The transformation of the federal courts under Trump has its origins in the presidency of Barack Obama. Until 2013, Senate rules meant 60 votes were required to confirm appeal court judges. Harry Reid, then the Democratic Majority Leader, changed the threshold to a simple majority, citing obstruction amidst Obama's nominees by Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell. After Republicans took back the Senate in 2015, the confirmations ground to a near halt. Good old Mitch eventually refused to allow even hearings for nominations, let alone a vote. The result of this was a raft of vacancies waiting to be filled when Trump took office. His first confirmed appeal court judge took up a seat on the 6th Circuit in 2017, a seat that had been empty for 4 years. Unlike the Democrats, Republicans under Trump moved with a single focus to fill court vacancies. This will have shifted the legal paradigm in the US for years, if not decades, for legislation that relates to things like Obamacare, LGBTQ plus rights, civil rights. Basically, anything with a slight liberal scent to it is probably going to be decimated. Can we imagine for a second a presidency under Hillary Clinton and how different the next few years, even the 4 years of Trump, just for the judiciary, could have been?
I mean, it's terrifying to be perfectly... I mean, I'll put Hillary to one side, but I will look at Trump. The entirety of how America is run has been completely shifted. I mean, we now have, with the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we've now got 3 more Supreme judges that are exceptionally conservative. I mean, the ramifications of that, I mean, everything is held within these judges.
In the US, there are 870 sort of, let's say, appeal level judges. So that goes from the Supreme Court at the very top to the Court of Appeals to district courts, and then alongside that there's sort of the International Court of Trade, or Court of International Trade rather. It's not so Trump alone has packed about, what was it, like 30% of all judges now in the US, right? If Joe Biden and Kamala Harris get a majority in the Senate, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they can approve an amendment to the Constitution to increase the number of judges that are active, right? And therefore, that could swing the sort of leaning of the judicial system in the US back towards the centre in that 4-year period. Yeah, okay. Rebalance it. If not, start swinging it slightly over to the more liberal side of the spectrum. So it's not outside the world of possibility. It relies on a lot of things, though. And one of those things is that they win the Senate in January. So we've got a good news story.
We do. So Zimbabwe, in this month last year, banned mining in all of its national parks, which is reversing a decision to let Chinese firms explore for coal. The move came after campaigners took the government to court to prevent ecological degradation in the parks.
Good for the environment.
Pretty good news story. So shall we now move swiftly on to October?
Yes, we roll on to October. So most of the things we had so far have been pretty politically based. This one delves more into the realms of technology and the ethics around it. So in October last year, Oculus, owned by Facebook, released their Oculus 2 headset, and what might seem fairly trivial release. It's not without its problems. Facebook announced that they'll be requiring users of the Oculus platform to sign in with a Facebook account. And while that might seem like it's not that big an issue, after all, services requiring a login are hardly a new thing, requiring users to create or already have a Facebook account to use hardware which they already own is kind of concerning, at least to me. Not only does this intrude on the user's ability to use the hardware as they see fit, it also presents privacy concerns. A recent study published by Stanford University found that using only the VR position tracking data, they were able to identify an individual from a group of more than 500 participants using a simple machine learning model with about 95% accuracy using less than 5 minutes of tracking data, which is concerning.
So why is this a problem to the everyman, though? Because if you've never owned an Oculus Rift and they never have your movement data, and I'm just personally, and I'm sure that it is an issue, I'm just saying personally, I don't really see where the threat is to your everyman.
So the global VR market is estimated as of 2020 to be approximately 12 billion USD. It's not a small market, but compared to the number of people that are using computers for gaming, it is a relatively small number. And so you're right, that to the everyday individual, this isn't too much of a privacy concern, but it is a concern. The issue is not really just one of security, said. I mean, I appreciate that you might not be too concerned about it, but for a lot of people and a growing number of people, the sheer fact that Facebook has such a large amount of identifiable information on them is concerning in of itself.
So I suppose the what's next for this topic then relies on a lot of assumptions. So the assumption A being a lot of people end up, like a good 33.3% of society owns an Oculus Rift Facebook device. Let's just assume it's Oculus for the moment, not just VR in total. So I'm almost 100% sure that all VR headsets will be collecting some sort of data like this, right? Then the second thing is, okay, so Facebook, who it is a bit rubbish that they've made it so that the Oculus can only be used on their platform. So let's assume that Facebook now owns the data for 33% of society about their movement. The part C, I suppose, is that has to be given to an authority of some sort who can abuse that, right? Like,
well, Facebook are the authority who can abuse it. That's the thing. Facebook's biggest moneymaker is advertising, or linking people with services and targeting those ads. The more targeted that you can make an advertisement, the more you can make money from that. If you can charge more for that. So Facebook is incentivized to gather as much personal information as they can about the people using their platform. And so more and more people are getting concerned about it.
Just because we can't necessarily see the risks right now does not mean necessarily there aren't risks going forward.
What my concern is, I've just as I had highlighted, is if they take this, the part C, as it were, is if they take this data, like they can collect my movement data as part of the service of using Oculus. At the end of the day, as I said, I say it jestingly, but at the end of the day, now, if they got a majority of data from me, I might get an advert for an insole because they know I walk a bit funny, or a walking stick as I currently use, or etc., etc. But until that data ends up being used by an actual physical power authority like the police or law enforcement or something, and they're able to track me and recognize me walking down the street, that's when I'd have a concern.
Well, that might be where your concern starts, but for a lot of people, it's concerning to them that Facebook has that information in the first place, and that by the looks of it, they'll be able to attribute it to individuals even when it's supposedly anonymized. And it's not just as generic as you have an insole because you walk a certain way. They're able to pick up more specific things, and so they can start to make judgments about your physical characteristics as a whole. If they can now start to say they are a person of X height, X body movement, and X build, that makes an individual more identifiable, as well as allowing, again, Facebook to exploit that data more than you'd maybe initially intended as a customer. And you're right when you said earlier on that as an individual using a Facebook service, you expect there to be a certain amount of data collection. That's what you subscribe to. It's part of the fact they're giving you a free service. But by making that mandatory to use the hardware that you own as an individual, you're now locked in with no choice but to pass that information across if you want to use this hardware that they've created. The argument obviously is that if you don't want to provide that information and have to use that service, don't use that hardware. But for some, this is what they have been bought by family or friends. This is what you have. And there's a certain amount of wanting to be able to use the hardware that you own without having to give information over to a company like Facebook.
Yeah, because you own it.
Yeah. So I'll put my hands up now as an Oculus user. I have a vested interest in this story. I considered purchasing a headset, a Quest 2, when they were announced. And I'll admit to having been given pause for thought of this, not because I have any concerns particularly about what my tracking data says about me, but it's enough to make me consider whether or not this is a platform that I want to give that much information about myself. The use of the data in some ways is irrelevant to the validity of the concern when it comes to a single company having that much information on you.
Yeah, so there's also, I suppose, a good point that comes from this, isn't there, Louis, that recently at the end of December, the Federal Trade Commission said that Facebook Group has to break up its assets, which meant WhatsApp and Instagram.
But it extends to all of them.
It extends to all of them, yeah, you're quite correct. So, Facebook can have 100% ownership in Facebook, but it's been asked to separate and split Instagram and WhatsApp from its services, and to some extent been asked to dilute its share in Oculus. We could see that actually Facebook might have to unravel some of its connection to hardware, and it might be that it says create an account or sign in with Facebook, as opposed to just being told you must sign in with Facebook. But also, weren't you saying that it's not just about, logging into Facebook, but any games that you purchase as well will be connected to that account?
Right, so any games now that you purchase through the Oculus Store will be associated to that Facebook account. And so we have to think about the implications for people who can't have a Facebook account. For instance, child for Christmas, 11 years old, gets a Oculus Quest 2 headset, entirely plausible. However, Facebook has a lower age limit of 13. So that child is now in a position of either having to falsify a Facebook account that is older than they are, or use a parent's account. And in both cases, that's a breach of the Facebook terms of service. And so if you break your user agreement, you lose that account, and therefore anything that you've paid for associated to that account. So you can end up in the position of losing all these titles you've bought, no opportunity for a refund potentially, and all because you're just trying to use the hardware that you own.
I think at some point we should look at digital monopolies and how they kind of control most of what we use online.
Well, after that topic,
We've got our good news story. So this month's good news story is that Spitting Image, a British satirical television puppet show created by Peter Fluck, Roger Law and Martin Lambinas, returned to our TV sets. So it was first broadcast in 1984. It went on for 18 series, so it was quite a big thing in the UK. And now it's back with a vengeance, but it featured puppet caricatures of celebrities and public figures, including at the time Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and John Major. So yeah, that's I suppose in some regards it's a good news story as an adult puppeteer comes to our screens again. But I suppose, 2020 being as it was, we needed a bit of satire to make things worthwhile. Despite the fact that Donald Trump could do it himself, why not have another puppet who is has someone with a hand up their rear end playing tunes out their mouth, because that's definitely not what Donald Trump is.
Well, talking of Donald Trump, that leads us quite nicely into November, which hands down has to be about the US presidential election.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. The 2020 United States presidential election was held on Tuesday, the 3rd November. Joe Biden was eventually elected as the 46th president of the United States after a number of key states swung to Biden, with postal votes being overwhelmingly Democratic and unseating the current president, Donald Trump. Trump's lawyers continue to challenge the result to this day, making claims over tampering in various areas of the election.
I know he's the president. I know we should afford the office a certain amount of respect, but he's damaged a lot of the reputation internationally. Maybe we'll see Joe Biden hopefully try and recover the damages that Donald's done.
Well, aside from what might happen on Inauguration Day, so putting aside whether or not Trump will actually leave the Oval Office, let's hope he does. But, a Biden presidency, and bearing in mind we recorded this on the 2nd of January, will be make or break when we have the Georgia Senate runoff. Without control of the Senate, for the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, very little could happen. In terms of things that require actual funding, he could be hampered no end.
So we could have a Democratic president, but a Republican Senate, and at that point, you can't get anything moving.
Unless the Democrats win this Senate runoff, the first 2 years of Biden are going to be pretty light.
Really?
He can return to the Paris Agreement, can look at developing trade agreements with the UK and others. That's all within his remit. That's fine. But domestically, he could be shot.
But there is some good that comes out of the election.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Which leads us on to our good news story for the month, which is that Kamala Harris made history as the first woman vice president in the United States, and also the first black and first Asian American US vice president-elect. She leads a slew of firsts, from Sarah McBride being elected as the first transgender state senator, to Jen O'Malley Dillon becoming the first woman to manage a winning Democratic presidential campaign, and record numbers of LGBTQ+ people being elected to Congress.
It's getting more and more representative, let's put it that way.
It certainly is.
Fingers crossed it stays that way. Anywho, on to December.
Finally, it's December. More precisely, December the 2nd. The UK approves Pfizer-BioNTech's vaccine, becoming the first country in the world to do so.
Huzzah!
Huzzah! The UK was the first nation to begin a mass inoculation campaign using a clinically authorised, fully tested vaccine, with a little lady known as Margaret Keenan, a 90-year-old grandma, being the first patient in Britain at, I believe, the University Hospital in Coventry?
Yes.
And since we first looked at this news story, Oxford AstraZeneca has been approved as well now.
Fantastic. That is absolutely...
This week, I believe.
Oh, wow.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Margaret's received her second vaccination jab, so she could potentially be fully immunised.
Oh, wow. So, what's next?
Well, unfortunately, obviously, Christmas was a thing where we all thought we were going to have a long period to go see friends, family, etc.
Yeah.
But that all got scrapped, and we only got to move around for Christmas Day.
Yeah.
But on the plus side, we're looking at how we can start rolling out this inoculation campaign even further. And in doing so, hopefully, we'll see the majority of society given the vaccine by mid-2021.
Okay.
Whether or not that happens is nothing entirely. So we'll see. But yeah, there's good things to come in 2021 just because of the COVID vaccine. And we've given quite a credence to COVID this podcast, but it is what it is. It was a pretty significant thing that happened. But I suppose, as we all know, the good news story for December is
It's over.
2020 is finally over.
Yeah.
So, with that being done and said, I suppose it's time for us to end our first podcast for the 2020 in review. It's been a mixed bag of a year to say the least. So, thank you for listening. We've been Patrick,
George,
And Louis.
and this was What's Next. And we'll see you in our next episode.
December was Let's just get to the end.